But first, let's lay out where things stand after Nevada. Senator Bernie Sanders won Saturday's Nevada caucuses in commanding fashion with nearly 88% of the vote in. NBC News projects Biden will finish in second place, right now at 21%, quite a distance from Bernie Sanders at 47%. Mayor Pete Buttigieg sits in third place, and despite a strong debate performance, Senator Elizabeth Warren is in a disappointing fourth, just as she did in New Hampshire, her neighboring home state. Sanders won with a broad coalition of support. He dominated among Hispanics with 51%. He won more white voters than any other candidate. He was second only to Joe Biden among black voters. He won 49% of voters who described themselves as very liberal. He tied Biden among Democrats who described themselves as moderate or conservative. He ran away with young people, winning 65% of voters under 30 and 57% of voters under 45. He also dominated among those who say they prefer a candidate who agrees with them on the issues, and placed first among voters who say their priority is to beat Trump. Here's Sanders addressing his supporters after that sweeping victory.
Trump and his friends think they are going to win this election. They think they're going to win this election by dividing our people up based on the color of their skin or where they were born or their religion or their sexual orientation. We are going to win because we are doing exactly the opposite. We're bringing our people together.
Big win for Bernie. Here are the second and third place finishers in Nevada reacting to Sanders' big win.
Do you think that Bernie Sanders is capable of beating Donald Trump?
I think I'd like whomever the Democrat is to beat Donald Trump. I'd vote for Mickey Mouse against Donald Trump.
Sure, but do you think he can win?
The answer is I don't think he can beat Donald Trump and keep a Democratic Senate, get a Democratic Senate and keep a Democratic House.
Before we rush to nominate Senator Sanders in our one shot to take on this president, let us take a sober look at what is at stake for our party, for our values, and for those with the most to lose. There is so much on the line. Senator Sanders believes in an inflexible ideological revolution that leaves out most Democrats, not to mention most Americans.
Reverend Al Sharpton, let's first talk about Nevada. What happened? Why was it such a huge Bernie Sanders victory? And is that just a sign of things to come over the next few weeks?
It very well could be. It was a resounding victory, I think, for Senator Sanders. And I think it showed how many in the Democratic Party want to see the party really stand for change in a direct way. At the same time, it shows what the challenges now are for Sanders, because he is now the front runner that now has to prove that he can broaden his base to where he does not put Senate seats in jeopardy and House seats in jeopardy. Otherwise, the moderates will consolidate and try to stop him. The other thing I think that I take of note, Mika and Joe, is that he still has to work on the black vote. Let us not forget he came a long way from where he was with the black vote. But if the exit polls are correct, almost 3/4 of the black voters in Nevada voted against him, despite the fact he surpassed in every other area. And that will affect him in South Carolina and affect him in other states on Super Tuesday, where he's going to need a substantial black vote, and if he's the nominee, a huge black vote in November. Now, his supporters will say, oh, you're doing much better, and don't listen to people like Sharpton. But I'm saying to him that if he is going to be the nominee and victorious, he should not accept being second place or doing better. He has to work on the black vote issue. He has to work on areas that would show that he can expand his base without losing his core.
Adrian, let's talk about the second place finisher, Joe Biden. We said on this show on Thursday and Friday he had to finish in second place. He actually did finish in second place in a fairly comfortable manner. Now let's just move it on. He's got to win South Carolina. He's got to have a big win before Super Tuesday to push him through Super Tuesday. From what you saw in Nevada and what you're seeing early in South Carolina with talks of a possible Jim Clyburn endorsement, is Joe Biden in a position to win South Carolina?
You know, Joe, he is in a position to win South Carolina. I think he's got to be happy that the South Carolina primary is coming up in a couple days instead of 2 or 3 weeks from now, because Bernie Sanders is starting to close that lead that Joe Biden has had for a long time and enjoyed in South Carolina. But a couple of things. Number one, if Clyburn, in fact, is endorsing Joe Biden, which it sounds like that's what's happening, huge, huge boost. You cannot imagine, you cannot think of anybody in South Carolina who can give you a bigger boost in that state than Jim Clyburn. So that's going to be a big, big boost for Joe Biden. You know, and secondly, he does need to win. I don't think it needs to be like a 1 or 2 point win. It needs to be a pretty resounding victory in order for him to really get the momentum that he needs going to Super Tuesday. But, you know, Joe, something else I've been looking at in some of these Super Tuesday polls is when you look at that magic number, the 15% threshold that you've got to get as a candidate in order to qualify for delegates. In some states, only 2 or 3 candidates at the most, sometimes just 2 candidates, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, are the only ones that are hitting that threshold. So the longer that we've got 4 or 5 other candidates that are sort of duking it out for that moderate vote and keeping others under 15%, it's going to be that much more difficult for somebody like Joe Biden or even somebody like Mike Bloomberg, depending which one is outperforming each other in those states. It's going to be that much more difficult for them to get delegates. So, yes, Joe Biden with a win in South Carolina will have a lot of momentum going into Super Tuesday. But with a lot of these other candidates who are still in the race, assuming that they do remain in the race on Super Tuesday, it's going to be that much more difficult for sort of the alternate front runner to Bernie Sanders to do well in those states.
Well, Ross Douthat wrote a column comparing the Sanders, the basically never Bernie crowd, with an ever Trump crowd. And one of the things he said that allowed Donald Trump to win in 2016 was the fact that you had people like Jeb Bush and John Kasich and others hanging around long after it was obvious they could win the race. Mika, I'm wondering what you think about all this talk. Amy Klobuchar finished a really disappointing, I think she was at 4% in 5th place, 6th place. People are talking about how as well as she has done, as good of a campaign she's run, it is time for her to get out of the race. Also, a lot of people starting to talk about Elizabeth Warren, who finished weak again. She finished in 4th place in her neighboring home state where she was supposed to win in New Hampshire last week. This week, another disappointing finish. She's maybe in single digits. She's up to 10% now, but she's in single digits in most of these counts.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.